What kind of moment forces a man to stand alone before 250 enemy soldiers? What drives a single American cold, wounded, nearly out of ammunition to hold the line when every calculation says he should fall back or be overrun? And why were German troops, hardened by years of war, stunned by what one lone defender managed to do on a quiet winter road outside the Ardennes? These questions echo through history because the stand of Sergeant John R. McKinney remains one of the most astonishing one-man defenses ever recorded in the American Army, a moment when resolve outpaced fear, when instinct overtook exhaustion, and when one soldier carved his name into the silence of a dark jungle night. His ordeal raises a final question, one that lingers across decades. How could one man resist an entire enemy force for more than an hour and live to tell the story? Subscribe to the channel and unravel the forgotten stories and secrets of World War II, and let us begin. In the final year of World War II, as Allied armies pushed relentlessly toward Japan, the war in the Pacific entered a phase both brutal and strategically vital. It was spring of 1945, and American forces on Luzon were fighting to break the last remnants of the Japanese 14th Area Army. The island was a labyrinth of ridges, rice paddies, and thick tropical forest, its humid air carrying the smell of earth, sweat, and cordite. Many units fought in small dispersed positions, never quite certain where the next enemy patrol might come from. Sergeant John R. McKinney, a quiet Illinois farm boy turned machine gunner with the 33rd Infantry Division, served on one of those scattered outposts near the village of Dinglin. For days his platoon had faced small harassment attacks, probing shots from the tree line, rustling movements at night, the fleeting silhouettes of scouts testing American positions. But on the night of May 11th, something changed. The jungle went unnaturally silent. Veterans knew that quiet meant danger. It meant the enemy was gathering, timing, preparing, and somewhere in that silence, the responsibility of holding one sector of the perimeter fell to a single man standing his watch while the rest of his squad briefly slept. As the tropical night thickened, McKinney patrolled the faint outline of his foxhole, the leaves slick with dew beneath his boots. He had been awake far too long, his nerves stretched but alert, his hearing sharpened by weeks of combat. A distant crash echoed through the dark, a branch snapping under weight, then another. The noises multiplied, subtle at first, then unmistakable. This was no small patrol. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of boots pressed to the jungle floor, their steps absorbed by the soft earth. The Japanese 2nd Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment had launched a coordinated surprise attack aimed at overrunning the American perimeter, and McKinney's lonely position sat directly in the path of their advance. He sensed movement before he saw it, a dim shadow slicing through the brush. Then a sudden burst of motion, the first attacker at arm's reach, bayonet flashing. The strike never landed. McKinney reacted first, fast as instinct, driving his rifle butt upward with a crack that cut through the pre-dawn stillness. That sound, wood on bone, was the moment the quiet broke. The moment an entire enemy assault discovered that one American was not asleep, not off guard, and not about to yield. The attack erupted with terrifying speed, the Japanese charging forward in waves meant to overwhelm by sheer momentum. McKinney fired point blank, then swung the rifle as a club when the ammunition ran dry, striking with a force born of desperation. 2 attackers fell at his feet in seconds. Another lunged from his right, steel gleaming faintly in the dark. McKinney seized him by the uniform, dragging him down the incline and wrenching the bayonet free. The jungle floor turned into a chaotic struggle of limbs, cloth, and adrenaline. Reports later suggested he killed several attackers by hand in those first moments, each second buying the platoon precious time to wake and respond. But they were still far behind him, and the enemy kept coming. The machine gun section he supported lay just yards away, but at this hour the gun itself was silent, its crew unaware of the storm breaking around them. McKinney knew that if the Japanese seized that weapon, they could sweep the American positions and wipe out the entire platoon. So he pushed forward alone, driving the enemy off the gun pit before they could reach it, reloading under fire as shouts in Japanese filled the night. The muzzle flashes lit the brush in brief, violent strobe, each flash revealing more silhouettes closing in. The firefight intensified, spreading outward as attackers swarmed from multiple angles. Japanese hand grenades landed near McKinney's feet, splintering trees and showering dirt across his helmet. The concussive shock rattled his chest, but he did not fall back. One fragment tore into his arm, another lodged near his shoulder. He barely felt them. His world had narrowed to the immediate. One more magazine, one more target, one more second of survival. His movements were methodical, almost calm, as he shifted between his M1 rifle and captured Japanese weapons when his ammunition dwindled. The American lines were still stirring awake, scrambling to organize, but the bulk of the initial assault was falling squarely on him. Witness accounts and after-action reports estimated that between 200 and 250 Japanese soldiers pressed the attack in his sector. They forced him back step by step, yet he refused to break. The thick air pulsed with the sound of shouted commands, ricochets slicing through palm fronds, the dull blast of grenades detonating inches from where he crouched. And through the chaos, McKinney kept the attackers pinned, his lone defense standing between the enemy and the vulnerable sleeping men behind him. Minutes became a blur of close-quarters combat, and still the assault did not stop. Some historians describe this engagement as one of the most intense one-man actions in the Pacific Campaign. Its pace unrelenting, its stakes absolute. McKinney moved along the defensive line, transitioning from cover to cover with the practiced fluidity of combat instinct. He fired from the hip, controlled, efficient, each shot deliberate. When the enemy threatened to flank, he repositioned. When grenades forced him to the ground, he rose again before the next wave arrived. Darkness created confusion for attackers and defender alike, but McKinney's familiarity with the terrain gave him a slight advantage. He knew every shallow depression, every tree root, every angle of approach. The Japanese attempted to swarm the machine gun emplacement again, and he drove them off with a vicious burst from the weapon he had managed to repair and load under fire. The gunfire cut through the trees with a steady mechanical rhythm, its muzzle climbing as he swept across advancing shapes. That fire bought the rest of his platoon the time they needed to fully awaken and man their positions. But even then, the brunt of the attack still hammered the section McKinney held alone. As dawn crept across the treetops, the battlefield shifted in tone. Shapes once hidden by darkness became visible in gray morning light. The enemy, realizing that one man had stalled their assault, pressed with renewed intensity. They charged in small groups, attempting to overwhelm him at close range before additional American support arrived. McKinney met them again and again, sometimes firing at near point-blank distance, other times wielding bayonets or captured rifles like improvised clubs. According to surviving reports, he switched between at least 5 different weapons during the ordeal, an indication of both the intensity of the fight and the exhaustion of his ammunition. The ground at his feet was churned mud and debris. Shell fragments littered the air. The smell of smoke mixed with the heavy scent of wet earth and cordite, and still he held on. The rising daylight revealed the cost of the fight. Dozens of enemy bodies lay scattered across the approach, evidence of how close they had come and how violently he had pushed them back. The Japanese began to pull back slightly, regrouping for one final push, and McKinney, bleeding from multiple wounds, steadied himself to meet it. The final rush came suddenly, as determined as the first. Japanese soldiers vaulted forward in a last attempt to seize the American machine gun and break the line open before more U.S. units responded. McKinney braced behind a fallen tree, shouldering a Japanese rifle he had taken earlier. His hands were slick with sweat and blood, but his aim remained steady. He fired until the rifle clicked empty, then threw it aside and reached for another. The image of him wounded, alone, ringed by spent shells. Switching weapons in sequence became one of the defining impressions of the battle, mentioned repeatedly in accounts from officers who later surveyed the field. When the final attackers closed within a few yards, he rose from cover and met them head-on. Some fell to rifle fire, others to the butt of his weapon. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the assault faltered. The surviving Japanese broke into a chaotic retreat through the jungle, leaving behind more than 100 dead in front of McKinney's position. Their attempt to breach the perimeter decisively shattered. The silence that followed was not peace, it was exhaustion, disbelief, and the slow realization that somehow, impossibly, one man had held the line. His platoon emerged fully from their foxholes, stunned by the devastation in the clearing and by the sight of McKinney still standing, still gripping a weapon, still watching the tree line as though another wave might emerge at any moment. The battlefield told a story no words could capture. Spent magazines lay scattered across the ground. Empty cartridge belts draped over branches. Broken rifles, American and Japanese, were strewn among the fallen. The machine gun pit he had defended bore deep scars from grenades and small arms fire. And in the midst of it all stood McKinney, silent, breathing heavily, his uniform torn, his arms bleeding, his face calm in a way that unsettled even the veterans who knew him well. They counted the bodies in disbelief, trying to understand how he had survived, how he had repelled an entire battalion's assault alone long enough for the rest of the perimeter to react. The answer was simple, though no one could quite articulate it. Instinct, training, and the refusal to yield ground in a moment when everything hung by a thread. His superiors documented the event with careful precision. Interviews were conducted, positions were measured, trajectories and casualty reports were crossed. What they concluded became part of the Medal of Honor citation he would later receive, that Sergeant John R. McKinney single-handedly killed more than 100 enemy soldiers, prevented the capture of a vital machine gun position, and held his sector for over an hour under continuous assault. Some historians suggest the number of attackers may have been even larger based on the Japanese order of battle in the area, though official accounts typically state around 250 engaged his sector during the attack. The scale of his action made it one of the most extraordinary single-soldier defenses in modern American military history, and yet, McKinney himself rarely spoke of it afterward. Like many who fought in the Pacific, he carried the memory quietly, without embellishment, without pride. He returned home to Illinois after the war, resumed a quiet life, and lived in relative obscurity until his passing in 1997. His heroism was known, recorded, and honored but never exploited. Decades later, historians revisiting the Luzon campaign noted the significance of his stand not only for its sheer ferocity but for the strategic context surrounding it. The Japanese 14th Area Army was fighting a desperate defensive action, attempting to delay American advances long enough to protect evacuation routes and regroup remaining forces in the mountains. Small nighttime assaults, such as the one McKinney faced, were part of a larger pattern of infiltration tactics meant to erode American perimeter security. If the attack had succeeded, if the machine gun position had fallen, if the platoon had been overrun, a gap might have opened in the American line, enabling deeper penetration and heavier casualties across the wider front. McKinney's stand did not merely save his squad, it preserved his company's integrity at a critical moment. A single position held by a single soldier prevented a cascading disruption of the U.S. advance in that sector. His actions, while intimate and personal at the moment they occurred, rippled outward into the broader campaign in ways few could fully appreciate at the time. In the years that followed, soldiers who served with McKinney attempted to describe what set him apart. Many remembered him as quiet, modest, disciplined. He was not the loudest man, nor the most imposing. He was steady, the kind of soldier who carried out orders without hesitation and who rarely complained despite the grinding hardships of the Pacific theater. Some recalled that he took extra time to clean and maintain his weapons, a habit instilled early in his service. Others described him as watchful, always aware of the terrain, always listening. These traits came together in the chaos of that night. His quick reactions were not the product of sudden adrenaline, but of ingrained practice, the reflexes of someone who understood that in the close-quarters warfare of Luzon, the margin between survival and death was no more than a second's awareness. That awareness, combined with the rugged physical endurance of a farm upbringing, created a soldier uniquely suited to the moment fate placed before him. The landscape where McKinney fought has long since changed. The jungle overgrew the foxholes, the trees reclaimed the clearings, and time softened the scars left by explosions. But the questions raised by his story still resonate. What allows a man, isolated and outnumbered, to keep fighting when logic insists he cannot win? Is it training? Is it courage? Is it the instinctive drive to protect others? Or is it something deeper, a refusal to let fear dictate the outcome of a moment that matters? These are not questions with simple answers. They are reflections shaped by memory, by history, by the stories of those who returned and those who did not. McKinney's story endures not because he sought recognition, but because his actions illuminate a truth about war. Sometimes the fate of many rests on the resolve of one. As modern readers and listeners revisit accounts from the Pacific theater, McKinney's stand serves as a reminder of the human dimension behind military statistics and battlefield maps. The war was vast, spanning oceans and continents, involving millions of soldiers and civilians. But in the end, victory hinged on individuals, men standing watch in the dark. Men rising when the situation demanded it. Men who confronted fear and moved through it. McKinney's one-man defense exemplifies this reality. It was not part of a major offensive, not the turning point of a campaign, not a moment that altered the strategic balance of the war. And yet, in its raw intensity and human drama, it reflects the essence of combat in the Pacific: unpredictable, close-quarter, personal, and fought in conditions that tested the limits of endurance. Even today, military historians studying small unit engagements cite McKinney's action as an example of individual initiative under extreme pressure. His adaptability, shifting weapons, adjusting positions, maintaining situational awareness despite darkness and confusion, embodies the tactical demands of the Pacific theater's most grueling fights. His ability to absorb the shock of an overwhelming assault and respond with disciplined aggression defies easy explanation, yet aligns with the realities veterans have long described. In the most desperate moments, survival often depended on instinct, willpower, and the refusal to yield. McKinney's story also highlights the psychological dimension of combat. The isolation he experienced alone, surrounded, responsible for holding the line, represents an extreme test of mental resilience. That he succeeded speaks not only to his training, but to a calmness under fire that few possess, but that history occasionally reveals in the actions of ordinary soldiers thrust into extraordinary circumstances. As dawn fully lifted over Luzon on May 11th, the American perimeter stabilized. The Japanese assault in that sector had been decisively beaten back. Officers surveyed the field, recording what had occurred. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, not quite believing what they had witnessed. The forest was littered with the detritus of battle: shell casings, broken equipment, torn packs. Smoke rose in thin wisps from small fires ignited by grenades. The air smelled of wet soil, burnt powder, and the heavy scent of vegetation turned to mulch by explosions. Amid the wreckage stood the man who had held the line, pale from blood loss but unbowed, his breathing steady, his eyes still scanning for movement. McKinney's endurance in those final minutes defied logic. His legs trembled under him, yet he remained upright until the medics arrived. Only then, after confirming no further assault was imminent, did he finally allow himself to be led away. In later years, when veterans gathered to share stories, McKinney's name surfaced occasionally, always with respect, often with disbelief. Those who served in the Pacific understood how rare such moments were, how unforgiving the environment was, how easily an isolated position could be overrun. His action stood out precisely because it bordered on the impossible, and yet it happened. witnessed and recorded by those who lived through the aftermath. For many, it became something more than a remarkable feat. It became a symbol of what determination could achieve even in the bleakest circumstances. It became a reminder that history turns not only on grand strategies and major offensives but on individuals making decisions in moments of crisis. McKinney made his decision instinctively, without time to reflect, without certainty of survival. And that decision saved lives, preserved a perimeter, and earned him a place among the most extraordinary soldiers of his generation. As we look back now, decades removed from the gunfire and the jungle heat, the story retains its power. It compels us to ask again those questions that opened this reflection. What enables a man to stand alone against overwhelming odds? What pushes him forward when others would fall back? And what remains of such actions once the war ends and the world moves on? The answer lies not in medals or citations, though McKinney certainly deserved the Medal of Honor he received. The answer lies in the enduring human capacity for courage under pressure, for selflessness amid danger, for resolve in the face of fear. These qualities do not fade with time. They echo still, carried forward in stories like his, stories that remind us of the cost of war, the resilience of those who fought, and the extraordinary strength hidden within ordinary men. Even as the memory of that night hardened into the collective history of the Pacific War, its deeper meaning did not fully settle until years later. Because McKinney's stand was never just about the numbers, not the number of attackers, not the number of weapons he used, not the number of lives saved. It was about the strange, quiet truth that emerges only after war ends. Sometimes the most decisive acts happen far from the spotlight, carried out by men who never asked for recognition, men who returned home and slipped back into ordinary life with no desire to tell the world what they had done. McKinney was one of those men. He never sought to define himself by the battle at Dinglin. He carried it instead like a private weight, something he acknowledged only when asked. And even then, with the understatement of a man who knew that courage in war is not a single moment, it is a burden that lingers long after the last shot is fired. Years passed. The jungle grew over the battlefield, villages rebuilt, children played in fields once scarred by grenades and machine gun fire, and the island healed in its own slow way. But among military historians and veterans groups, McKinney's name resurfaced each time discussions turned to acts of impossible endurance, not simply because he held the line but because he embodied a kind of stoic willingness to face overwhelming force without yielding. He never saw himself as a symbol, yet that is what he became, a representation of an American soldier's resilience in one of the harshest campaigns of the Second World War. The Pacific was unforgiving, the conditions brutal, the fighting intimate and relentless, and McKinney's stand preserved a fragment of that reality for later generations. It showed that battles were not only won by divisions and brigades maneuvering across maps, but by individuals in foxholes at 3 a.m, fighting with whatever remained in their hands. By the time historians revisited Luzon in the decades after the war, little remained to mark the site where McKinney had stood. The terrain was unrecognizable, the foxholes filled, the tree lines changed, the scars erased by the slow persistence of nature. But the records remained, the eyewitness accounts preserved, the citation detailed and unambiguous. Those doing the research felt a strange reverence, knowing that somewhere beneath the undergrowth, beneath the soil enriched by decades of rain, the faint traces of that desperate struggle still existed, if only in memory. It reminded them that while the physical battlefield disappears, the human story endures in the minds of those who choose to preserve it. And in that sense, McKinney's story became something more than a historical footnote. It became a testament not only to bravery but to the quiet, unassuming men who shaped the outcome of a global conflict through actions that would never be witnessed by the world at large. McKinney lived long after the war, returning to a rural life far removed from the violence of Luzon. He married, worked, raised a family, the kind of life many veterans longed for but not all found. Those who knew him in later years often remarked on his calmness, a steadiness in his voice, a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the violence he had survived. When people asked about the Medal of Honor, he acknowledged it but rarely elaborated. For him, the medal was not a symbol of personal triumph. It was a reminder of a war that had taken friends, left scars, and shaped him in ways he never fully articulated. He never boasted, never sought attention, never used the citation to elevate himself above others. Like so many who returned from the Pacific, he carried his memories privately, quietly, as though speaking them aloud might revive the darkness he had fought so hard to leave behind. But those who study war understand that stories like his matter precisely because they illuminate the human dimension of conflict, the moments when ordinary men faced extraordinary odds and acted with a clarity that defies explanation. McKinney's stand is one of those rare events where the individual becomes the pivot point upon which a larger outcome depends. It wasn't strategic brilliance or overwhelming firepower that saved his platoon. It was one man's refusal to abandon his post, one man's willingness to endure, one man's instinctive resolve to hold the line long enough for others to rise beside him. That truth resonates across generations because it speaks to something deeper than tactics or battlefield reports. It speaks to the quiet strength that resides in men who would never call themselves heroes, even though history insists they are. As time moves forward, fewer witnesses remain to tell these stories firsthand. Fewer voices echo the chaos of the Pacific, the isolation of its night battles, the smell of jungle decay and gunpowder mingling in humid air. And that is why stories like McKinney's must be told, not to glorify war, but to remember the human cost of it, the weight carried by those who bore its burden. His stand on that dark May morning is not simply a tale of one man against impossible odds. It is a stark reminder of the fragility of life in war, the thin line between survival and annihilation, the remarkable resilience hidden within men who never expected to be remembered. It underscores the idea that courage is not a roar but a steady heartbeat in the face of terror, a willingness to act when everything in the world seems to be collapsing. In the final measure, Sergeant John R. McKinney's story endures because it reveals the power of individual will in the crucible of war. He did not know, in the moment he rose from his foxhole, that his actions would be recorded, studied, or honored. He knew only that the enemy was coming, that his platoon was vulnerable, and that he stood between them and destruction. That clarity of purpose, simple, direct, unadorned, carried him through an hour of relentless combat. And when the sun rose over Luzon, casting its first light across the battered clearing, he was still there, battered but unbroken. It is that image more than the reports or the medals or the written citations that lingers. A lone figure standing in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by spent shells and torn earth, having held the line when no one else was awake to defend it. His courage did not change the course of the entire war. It did not alter grand strategy or shift the balance of power across the Pacific. But it saved the lives of the men beside him, preserved the integrity of a defensive line, and demonstrated the rare strength a single human being can summon when everything depends on it. And that is why, all these years later, the question still resonates. How did one American soldier hold off 250 determined attackers for more than an hour alone? The answer lies not in myth, but in the unmistakable reality of what he did, and in the quiet, enduring truth of why he chose to stand. And in that truth his story lives on, not just as a chapter of military history but as a reminder that some acts of courage stand outside the passage of time, carved permanently into the memory of all who seek to understand what war reveals about the human spirit.
If you've stayed to the end, you're one of the few who still wants the truth. Subscribe, and together, we'll uncover every secret the Second World War tried to keep buried.